Amara Grant had always been ambitious. She worked hard to get where she was, Collins Associates, one of the top insurance firms in the country. It wasn't just a job, it was a career she had spent years building, proving herself over and over again in an industry that didn't always welcome women, especially black women, into its highest ranks. But she had done it. She had earned her place. And then Richard Collins happened. He was powerful, charming in a way that made people trust him, believe in him. Amara had been no different. Late nights at the office turned into quiet conversations, stolen glances, and eventually, something more. She had convinced herself that there was something real between them, that he saw her for more than just an employee. But she had been wrong. The moment she told Richard she was pregnant, everything changed. She had rehearsed the conversation 100 times in her head, thinking maybe he'd be shocked but ultimately willing to do the right thing. But when she sat in front of him, hands trembling, voice shaking, all she got was cold indifference. "I see," he had said, his voice flat, emotionless. Amara's stomach had twisted. "It's yours, Richard," she had added, as if saying the words would make him acknowledge the truth. His reaction was a sigh, a slight narrowing of his eyes. "This is unfortunate." Unfortunate. That word had hit her harder than she expected. She had imagined anger, maybe even fear, but not detachment. She tried to reason with him. "I thought we could figure something out. I'm keeping the baby." Richard stood from his chair and walked around his desk, his expression unreadable. "Amara," he said, as if he were speaking to an employee who had messed up a report, "I can't be involved in this. You know that." And just like that, it was over. By the end of that conversation, Amara wasn't just heartbroken. She was unemployed. Richard made sure of that. Within hours, HR called her in, offering her a severance package that felt more like hush money. When she tried to find work elsewhere, doors slammed in her face. She quickly realized Richard had done more than fire her, he had erased her from the industry. Alone, pregnant, and without a job, Amara walked out of Collins Associates for the last time. The future she had built crumbled in front of her. But as she stepped onto the cold city street, she placed a protective hand over her stomach. She might have lost everything, but she wasn't alone. She still had her baby. And somehow, they would survive. Tyrell Grant had worked for this moment his entire life. Getting hired at Collins Associates wasn't just a job, it was a milestone. A foot in the door at one of the most prestigious insurance firms in the country. It was everything he and his mother had sacrificed for. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, inhaling deeply as he tried to steady his nerves. His mother, Amara, sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. She had been quiet all morning, unusually so. "Mom, how do I look?" Tyrell asked, flashing a grin as he spun around, trying to break the tension. Amara forced a smile. "You look sharp, baby." But something in her eyes was off. Tyrell frowned, stepping closer. "You okay? You don't seem as excited as I thought you'd be." Amara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. I don't know about that place," she murmured. Tyrell's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "It's one of the top firms in the country, Mom. This job could change everything for us." "I know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want you to be careful." The way she said it sent a strange chill down Tyrell's spine, but he brushed it off. His mother had always been protective. Maybe it was just nerves. He kissed her on the forehead before heading out the door. "Love you, Mom." Love you too, baby. Walking into Collins Associates felt surreal. The building was massive, sleek glass walls reflecting the towering skyline of Midtown. Inside, everything was pristine, polished floors, the hum of phones ringing, the scent of expensive cologne and fresh coffee lingering in the air. He checked in with the receptionist, who barely looked up before directing him to his supervisor. Miss Robinson will take you upstairs. Miss Robinson was a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense attitude. She walked him through the office, explaining company policies and expectations as they weaved through the rows of cubicles. We expect high performance here, Grant, she said, barely glancing at him. Collins Associates doesn't believe in second chances. Tyrell nodded, taking in every word. Then, as they turned a corner, he saw him. Richard Collins. The man was standing at the far end of the office, speaking with a group of senior executives. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that made people straighten up when he walked by. His dark, graying hair was neatly combed, and his tailored suit screamed power. Tyrell felt something strange twist in his chest. He had seen Richard Collins before, on magazine covers, in business articles, on TV interviews, but never in person. And now, here he was. Richard's gaze shifted, locking onto Tyrell. For a split second, the CEO's expression flickered, something unspoken passing behind his sharp blue eyes. Recognition? No. That wasn't possible. Tyrell was just another new hire. Another nameless face in a company of hundreds. And yet, Richard's stare lingered for a beat too long before he turned back to his conversation. Miss Robinson kept walking, unaware of the silent exchange. Tyrell's heart pounded. Something felt off. But he shook it off. He was overthinking. Richard Collins didn't know him. Not yet. Tyrell couldn't focus. For the rest of the day, his mind refused to settle. The conversation with his mother, the way Richard Collins had looked at him, it all churned inside him, creating a storm he couldn't control. He had dreamed of working at Collins Associates for years, but now, every corner of the office felt suffocating. Every polite smile from a coworker, every passing glance, felt like a lie. And Richard Collins? That man was walking around this building like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't abandoned his own son. Like he hadn't destroyed Amara's life. Tyrell gritted his teeth, fingers clenched into fists beneath his desk. He wanted to walk straight into that glass-walled office, stand in front of Richard, and demand answers. But what would that get him? Richard was a businessman. A strategist. He would find a way to shut Tyrell down before the conversation even started. No, this needed to be done right. That night, as Tyrell sat at the kitchen table, his mother watching him carefully from across the room, he knew she sensed it too, the storm brewing inside him. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Amara asked quietly. Tyrell shook his head. "How could I?" Her gaze softened. "I just don't want you to get hurt." Tyrell exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Mom, he got away with it. He erased you from that industry, left you with nothing. And he's still sitting at the top, untouched." He looked up, his jaw tight. "That's not right." Amara held his gaze for a long moment before sighing. "I know, baby. But men like Richard, they don't fall easily." "Then I'll push harder," Tyrell said, voice low but firm. He needed to catch Richard off guard. Tyrell had overheard some senior employees mentioning Richard's usual dinner spot, a high-end restaurant where he entertained clients, where he presented himself as the perfect family man. That was where it had to happen. A confrontation at the office would be easy for Richard to control. But in public? In front of his wife, his son, and the people who respected him. There, Richard wouldn't be able to ignore him. Wouldn't be able to brush him off like an inconvenience. As the plan solidified in his mind, Tyrell felt his anger sharpen into something clearer, something with purpose. The next evening, as he stepped onto the subway, his reflection in the window looked different, more determined, more unshakable. The old Tyrell, the one who had dreamed of rising through the ranks at Collins Associates, was gone. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about making Richard Collins face what he had done. And nothing was going to stop him. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversations, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was the kind of place where deals were made, where appearances mattered. And right in the middle of it all sat Richard Collins. Tyrell spotted him immediately. He was seated at a prime table near the window, the city skyline stretching out behind him like a perfectly curated backdrop. Across from him sat Catherine, his wife, elegant as ever, sipping from a glass of wine. Beside her, their son, Elijah, looked at his father with admiration, hanging on to every word. Tyrell's stomach tightened. This was the family Richard had chosen. The one he had built while erasing Tyrell and his mother from existence. Taking a deep breath, Tyrell squared his shoulders and walked straight toward the table. At first, Richard didn't notice him. He was too busy speaking, gesturing smoothly with his hands, exuding confidence. But then, just as Tyrell reached the table, Richard's gaze lifted, and everything changed. For the briefest moment, Tyrell saw it. The flicker of recognition. The tightening of his jaw. The way his fingers clenched around his fork. But then Richard's expression smoothed, his businessman's mask slipping into place. "Tyrell," he said, his voice calm but edged with warning. "What are you doing here?" Catherine glanced up, her brow furrowing. "Richard, who is this?" Tyrell let the silence stretch for a moment. Then, with measured control, he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "I'm your son." The words landed like a grenade. Catherine inhaled sharply. Elijah frowned, his confusion deepening. And Richard just sat there, his face unreadable, but his grip on his silverware tightened. "What?" Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft murmur of the restaurant. Richard cleared his throat, reaching for his glass of wine. "This isn't the time or place." "This is exactly the time and place," Tyrell cut in. His voice was steady, but beneath it burned years of anger. "You've spent your life pretending I don't exist. I think it's time your family knows the truth." Catherine's face paled. "Richard, is this true?" Richard exhaled, setting his glass down with forced precision. "Catherine, let's not do this here." "So it is true." Her voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. Elijah's expression darkened. "You have another son? And you never told us?" Richard's jaw tightened. It was a mistake. A long time ago. Tyrell felt something inside him snap. A mistake? His voice shook with barely contained rage. "You didn't just make a mistake. You abandoned my mother. You fired her. You blacklisted her from her career. You left her with nothing while you sat here, playing the perfect family man." Catherine looked like she had been slapped. "You did what?" Richard had gone pale, his carefully composed exterior cracking. "It wasn't that simple." "It was exactly that simple," Tyrell shot back. "You made sure she couldn't get another job. You ruined her life. And you never looked back. Elijah shoved his chair back, standing up so fast it nearly toppled over. Jesus, Dad. How could you do that? Richard looked at his son, then at his wife, and for the first time, the weight of what he had done seemed to settle on him. Tyrell leaned forward, his voice low but unyielding. You thought you could bury the past, Richard. Pretend I didn't exist. But I do. And now? So does your family. For the first time in his life, Richard Collins had nothing to say. The restaurant buzzed around them, oblivious to the wreckage unfolding at that table. Tyrell stood up, his chest heaving. He had said what he needed to say. And from the way Catherine and Elijah were looking at Richard, the damage was already done. Without another word, Tyrell turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Richard Collins to sit in the ruins of the life he had built on lies. The news spread like wildfire. What started as whispers at the restaurant soon turned into something much bigger. By the next morning, Collins Associates was buzzing with rumors. Employees exchanged glances in the hallways, hushed conversations took place in break rooms, and the air felt thick with anticipation. Something was happening. Tyrell sat at his desk, watching it all unfold. He didn't have to say a word, people already knew. The confrontation at the restaurant wasn't exactly private. Someone had seen. Someone had talked. And now, the story was everywhere. By noon, the speculation turned into confirmation. A company-wide email popped into everyone's inbox. Subject: company announcement. Effective immediately, Richard Collins has stepped down as CEO of Collins Associates. The board of directors has appointed an interim CEO as we transition into this next chapter. We remain committed to our values and the integrity of this company. Thank you for your dedication during this time. It was over. Richard was out. Tyrell stared at the email, letting the weight of it settle. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, pictured what it would feel like to see Richard Collins fall from grace. He had thought it would bring him relief, maybe even satisfaction. But all he felt was empty. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. I just saw the news. Are you okay? Tyrell exhaled slowly, typing back. Yeah. It just doesn't feel like I thought it would. The truth was, Richard's downfall didn't change the past. It didn't undo what he had done to Amara. It didn't erase the years of struggle she had endured alone. The man who had once controlled everything, who had held power over careers, reputations, and lives, was now just another disgraced businessman. But that didn't mean justice had truly been served. The whispers in the office grew louder throughout the day. Some people seemed shocked. Others, not so much. It was clear now that Richard's spotless reputation had always been more illusion than reality. Miss Robinson, his supervisor, approached his desk later that afternoon. Can we talk? She asked. Tyrell followed her to a small conference room, the glass walls offering a clear view of the office floor. She folded her arms, studying him carefully. So, I'm sure you've seen the news. Tyrell nodded. Yeah. She hesitated. Look, I don't know all the details, but people are talking. They know about your connection to him. Tyrell stiffened. He had figured as much. Miss Robinson sighed. This company is in damage control mode. With Richard gone, there's going to be a lot of restructuring. A lot of eyes on everything, including you. Tyrell frowned. What does that mean for me? She shrugged. That depends on what you want. Do you want to stay here? Or do you want to move on? Tyrell hadn't thought that far ahead. All this time, his focus had been on Richard. Exposing him. Making him face the truth. But now, with Richard gone, what was left for him here? Collins Associates wasn't his future. It was Richard's past. Miss Robinson's voice softened. Whatever you decide, just make sure it's what you really want. Not just what feels like revenge. Tyrell nodded slowly. I'll think about it. As he left the conference room, he glanced around the office, feeling something shift inside him. This place had once represented everything he wanted. Now, it felt like a cage. It was time to decide what came next. Tyrell sat at his desk, staring at the glowing screen in front of him. The words on the report blurred together, meaningless. He wasn't thinking about work. He hadn't been, not since the moment Richard Collins walked out of this company in disgrace. He had won. Or at least, that's what he thought winning would feel like. But as he looked around the office, at the people who were still moving forward, still working as if nothing had changed, he felt a hollowness settle in his chest. The company had lost its leader, but nothing else seemed different. The machine kept running, and he was still just another cog in it. Did he really want to stay here? Miss Robinson's words from the day before echoed in his head. You need to decide what you want. Not just what feels like revenge. He had spent so long chasing after justice, after a confrontation that would make Richard Collins face what he had done. And now that it had happened, he realized something. His future wasn't here. It never had been. He had fought so hard to get into Collins Associates, thinking it would be his ticket to success. But all along, he had been chasing a version of success that wasn't his own. This wasn't his company. This wasn't his path. The realization hit him like a weight lifting off his shoulders. He didn't belong here. And he didn't have to stay. Tyrell opened a blank email and began typing. His resignation letter was short, direct. He didn't need to explain himself, he just needed to walk away. By the time he finished, his hands felt lighter, his breath easier. This was his choice. Not Richard's. Not anyone else's. His. He hit send. A deep exhale left his chest as he stood up, grabbing his things. The moment felt surreal, like stepping out of a life he had forced himself into and finally choosing something different. As he made his way toward the exit, a few coworkers glanced at him curiously. He didn't stop to explain. There was nothing left to say. The doors of Collins Associates closed behind him, and for the first time in a long time, Tyrell felt free. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his mother, just like they always had. Amara didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, waiting. I quit, Tyrell finally said. A slow smile spread across her face. I knew you would. Tyrell let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Of course you did. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. I'm proud of you. For a long time, he had thought that success meant proving himself in the corporate world, climbing the ladder at all costs. But now, he saw things differently. Success wasn't about following in someone else's footsteps. It was about creating his own path. He didn't know what was next, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of that. He was finally moving forward, on his own terms. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the small apartment. Tyrell sat at the table, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, steam curling into the air. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't rushing to check his emails. No deadlines. No meetings. No reports waiting to be filed. And yet, he had never felt more alive. Across from him, Amara stirred her tea, watching him with quiet amusement. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "how does it feel to be unemployed?" Tyrell chuckled, shaking his head. "Honestly, it feels good." Amara smirked. "Not what you expected, huh?" "No," he admitted. "But that's the thing, I don't think I ever really knew what I wanted. I spent so much time chasing something that wasn't mine to begin with." Amara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, we get so caught up in proving ourselves that we forget to ask if it's even worth proving." Tyrell exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, that's exactly it." For years, he had measured success by titles, salaries, and the approval of people who didn't even know his name. He had thought that getting into Collins Associates would mean something, that it would give him validation, a sense of purpose. But success built on someone else's foundation wasn't success at all. Now, he had the chance to build something real. "I think I want to start over," he said finally. "Not in some big company. Not chasing someone else's dream. I want to do something that actually means something to me." Amara's smile was warm, full of pride. "And what does that look like?" Tyrell thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't know yet. But that's the exciting part, right?" She laughed. "It is. And whatever you do, I know you'll be great at it." He looked around the apartment, the same small space where his mother had raised him, where they had struggled and survived together. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. It was real. And it reminded him that no matter where he went next, he wasn't starting from nothing. He was starting from strength. Later that day, Tyrell stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. The city stretched before him, bustling, alive with possibilities. For the first time, he wasn't walking toward someone else's expectations. He was walking toward his own future. And that was everything.